Well, Craig, thank you so much for helping my project. Can you say a little bit about yourself?
Well, let's see. My entire life has been within the boundaries of the space age. I was born actually slightly before the launch of Sputnik 1. So I followed the entire program. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a test pilot, but then my eyes went bad when I was 7, and so I angrily gave that up and instead went into studying the sciences instead. I graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1985 with a degree in mathematics and have worked as a systems and software engineer ever since, and sometimes a IT consultant.
Are you still in Minneapolis?
I am. Yep, yep.
Uh,
Hence the snow removal. Yeah.
Awesome. I actually go to Minneapolis, well, before COVID, because my manager and my team that I work with is actually based in Minneapolis. So I
Oh,
kind of go there a few years. Maybe after this COVID thing's over with and I find myself in Minneapolis, maybe we can meet up for a coffee or lunch or dinner or
yeah,
something.
sure, absolutely. I would love
Um,
that.
so can I have one thing in common with the current NASA administrator, Jim Bridenstine. We were both born in 1975, which
Oh,
is missing the whole last time going to moon by 3 years.
mm-hmm.
And my biggest memory around space, earliest memories, had to do with the shuttle,
Right.
the Challenger
Yep.
incident, you know, and and getting to go and visit, sort of seeing the artifacts after the Apollo program.
Right.
And I think by the time I became really aware of it, Star Trek was the most hopeful go forward thing I have. So I'd like, if you could, to kind of take me back to your childhood,
Mm-hmm.
and if you could walk me through kind of what were your earliest memories of your experiences, but also kind of like the impressions you have about the people around you and what they were thinking.
Sure. I mean, my earliest memory of spaceflight was probably watching the ticker tape parade for John Glenn on broadcast television, where I must have been, geez, 4 or 5. But I remember it just like I remember the Kennedy funeral. There are things that get indelibly etched into your memory. So, and then I followed Gemini fairly heavily when I was in school and growing up, and obviously into Apollo. So I remember the shock and horror from the Apollo 1 fire, and how we pretty much figured that was going to kill the plan to make it within the decade, which of course it did not. And then following the likes of, Walter Cronkite and Jules Bergman broadcasting the launches of the various Apollo missions. And the one that actually stands out for me earlier the most is Apollo 8, which have happened right around Christmas. And I remember as we were driving from the cities to our family members who live in northern Minnesota, or who lived in northern Minnesota, listening to them on the radio, broadcasting from Apollo 8. And that was, for a young, impressionable me of about 11 years old, a fairly memorable incident. And then for Apollo 11, that was when we got our first color television set there. So we got it shortly before and set it up. So we watched the entire proceedings from the launch to the landing in color, which was quite amazing at the time. If you'd been in black and white era entirely before that, to see these things in color suddenly made them even more lifelike. And just the childlike wonderment from Cronkite and from Wally Schirra, who was his broadcasting partner, and from Jules Bergman over on a different network. It was all just fascinating times, and I regret that I didn't get more involved with commercial contractors, I guess, for NASA. They would have been at the time. My first job out of college was working for Honeywell, who was a contractor for NASA, but not the branch that I was working in at the time. So the only other thing I would say is, in the position I've been in for like about the past 7 years as a technical support engineer for software, various agencies of NASA and things like Blue Origin and things like that have been customers of mine, and it's been at least nice to vicariously work with them. And then my last other highlight was, I believe it was in 1991, my wife and I went and stayed with some friends in Florida, and the husband of our friend worked for NASA, and he arranged for us to go and see the Atlantis launch. And at the same time as that particular Atlantis launch, Endeavour was being brought out to the pad in preparation for its maiden launch. So that was a pretty exciting time.
That is really amazing. Yeah, the Apollo 1 fire, I, I think, at takeoff or landing, you're like, man, those are really traumatic events. But just going through an exercise on the launch pad,
Yep.
I mean, I've read like Gene Kranz, I think, was the flight controller at the time, and reading through his description of what he went through, I think there's a lot of disbelief of what was actually happening at the time. It's just kind of
Oh, well, of
beyond the
course, yeah.
just kind of beyond the realm of expectations that you could just, one moment you're checking and see if the radio is working, next moment you have people trapped inside of a furnace.
Yeah, no, the dramatization of that in the Tom Hanks series From the Earth to the Moon that was on HBO, I'm guessing the mid to late 90s, and you can still get it. But that's just excellent. That whole series was just excellent. But the way that they handled that particular case and the Senate inquiry afterwards, I thought was just brilliant.
Um, Now, most of the people that I talk to ask, um, why are we going back? Why now? And there's also another question I get asked is why do we stop going? And I was wondering what are your thoughts around that? Why did we stop going to the
Why
moon?
did we stop going? Well, I mean, it was very expensive, and to be honest, and I think as Neil deGrasse Tyson has put out a book about, it was largely linked to Cold War politics. And as the Cold War became thought out, and as we'd already been there and we did our stated goal of, beating our perceived opponents to landing on the moon, I think, it was just considered too expensive to continue moving on there. And it's just a shame because, as has been pointed out, when Harrison Schmitt was on the final mission, the final mission was the first scientist, and that was really a shame for that. And then there was the stuff with Skylab and all that they were trying to pursue instead. So that's why I think, it was largely just the expense, I think, is what killed it at the time. I think the reason now why people are thinking about returning has more to do with the fact of the commercial involvements in it, the SpaceX's and the Blue Origins and the places like that, rather than NASA directly, because NASA has done pretty damn good science using robotic explorers. And that's a really cost effective way for them to go to places that can't otherwise be explored. I mean, my excitement these days, more than even going to the moon, are, going to Europa and going to Titan and going to Enceladus, because those seem to be the places in the solar system that might harbor at least pre-biologic systems, and that's the thing that captures my fancy more than that. The moon, I see more as something that's probably going to be commercially try to be exploited for minerals and whatnot that's on the moon. Uh, the 2024 thing, I am skeptical about at least NASA going to the moon in 2024, especially because of the economic recovery we're going to have to do because of the pandemic. I was skeptical before because I think we've been being promised for over 30 years that, we're going to the moon again real soon now. And after having listened to enough of those broken promises, I tend to be highly skeptical of them when I hear them.
Well, I mean, there has been some progress with us going to the moon. Artemis 1 is the
Hmm.
first, kind of mission of the whole SLS, and Orion's uncrewed. Um, just this week, Lockheed Martin um, gave NASA transferred ownership of the first Orion capsule over to NASA for processing.
Sure,
Today we
sure.
have the final step of the green run test, hopefully 8-minute full duration firing of the core stage.
Yep.
And then, we have three teams of companies doing the human landing system. I, I mean, we've tried to go many times before, but never got past the PowerPoint stage. I feel like we actually have some flight-worthy hardware almost ready to fly.
No, I hope so. I hope so. And and it won't it won't hurt my feelings any if the 2024 date gets missed. I would certainly still like to see within my lifetime. I would like to see humans return both to the moon and however they do it to get at least a first landing on Mars. I'm not actually entirely convinced that it's going to be the US that does it first, and I'm okay with that too. Because as we start moving into space, we need to become more and more of a global collective civilization of people. And if anything, the greatest benefit from planetary exploration like that may in fact be that move towards a little more unification amongst the disparate peoples on planet Earth.
I, uh, so just kind of going back to the Apollo program and the motivations behind it, you were saying that it was mainly, more of a technological, political, economic demonstration of America's, you know, uh, strength, as opposed to really attempting to go and explore and develop, space resources and that type of thing. Um, I think what's more surprising to me is not that the program ended with Apollo 17, but that we even had an Apollo 12. Like, oh,
Yeah.
why, why did we go back a second time? I mean, I think that's something that uh, I find pleasantly surprising, considering the motivations for going. And maybe it's just, I mean, I understand that a lot of contractors were actually contracted to build out something like 500
Hmm.
or some huge number of Saturn V's and landers, and that somebody was really envisioning doing this indefinitely. Um, but then on the
Sure.
other hand, that sort of like the real political motivation was just to demonstrate how um, it seems like there's like kind of two conflicting uh, parts, showing that we could go to the moon
Hmm.
and back, and then another part that's like, hey, we're going to go and explore and continue to do things, and just kind of wondering, uh, you know, how come it looks like neither part really fully won? It seems like
Right.
if, and maybe that's just the compromises that we make, but I was wondering what your take was on it.
Well, I would presume since the money had already been invested in building, the Saturn V's and the spacecraft and the launch facilities and everything like that, I would guess there was certainly an attitude of, well, we got this stuff, we might as well fly it. And certainly it's interesting to me the enthusiasm from the American public, how that kind of waned. You remember the famous scene from the movie Apollo 13 where they broadcast from space and nobody's watching it because the Americans apparently had already gotten tired of that. So me, actually, the more interesting question is, why was there an Apollo 14? than an Apollo 12, because again, the only thing I can think of is, well, it's already built and ready to go, so what are we going to do with it? We might as well launch it. At least at that point is when they started making the push towards doing actual trained scientific observations on the moon, rather than just, yeah, we got there and we can land and we can come back home again. So it, it's an interesting time, and I suppose a lot of it had to do with Johnson being still in the presidency there, and given his love for the program, able to get things going. Although by then, I guess it was Nixon already, and Johnson was gone, and Nixon was sufficiently hawkish that I suppose continuing to wave it in front of the Soviet bloc probably appealed to him. I don't know.
Um, you mentioned that more than going to the moon and sort of the commercialization there, kind of discoveries of organic systems
Mhm,
on maybe the moons of Jupiter, maybe the moons of Saturn,
mhm.
and things like that really excited you more. Could you talk a little bit more about your enthusiasm and why that excites you?
Well, I'd been studying or following astrobiology basically ever since I discovered Carl Sagan, and his work even before Cosmos, things like The Cosmic Connection and The Dragons of Eden, but also the technical books that he edited from the conferences, where there were some really fascinating joint US, Russian, India, many other international participant conferences held in I guess it would be probably the early 1970s, where the foundations of SETI were being formed, and Frank Drake came out with his results from Project Ozma, and his famous Drake equation about that. And so for me, the main reason for going into space is to seek out new life forms and new civilizations. Basically, Roddenberry put his imprint on me as well when I was young, and that stayed with me.
Um, so I mean, just kind of thinking through that thinking. I mean, for a long time we didn't know how many planets there would be
Mhm,
around other suns. Is our system kind of unique in the fact that we actually have hard rocky planets with atmospheres that um, could sustain life? And then with like the Kepler missions and what have you, we've been able to find tens of thousands of exoplanets of all sorts of different sizes, and we're constantly
mhm,
finding new ones, and we're learning ways to sort of characterize them even better. So I guess just working through the Drake equation, it's like, the number of stars, then the number of stars that have planets, then the number of planets that could support
right.
life, and then, kind of working down. So this, I mean, would it be fair to say that this is sort of what you see as being helping to characterize that next component of the Drake equation? Can life, like how likely is it for life to
Mhm.
actually develop in places?
Right. I mean, once we get a second example, then I suspect, much like with exoplanets, we're going to find that there are lots of examples, and maybe some we hadn't known how to look for before. But we need to get that first capture of a second independently evolved. And it doesn't need to be advanced. It doesn't need to be Marvin the Martian or anything like that. I mean, microbes will fit the bill nicely, because we know when life on Earth was microbes and how long that evolutionary path took. And along with the likes of Sagan and Roddenberry, I also think of Michael Crichton and his, the famous "Life Will Find a Way" speech they make in Jurassic Park. And I think that's basically true, is that once what we've seen with life, they have for things like even, tardigrades and things like that, when life starts, it just kicks into evolution mode. and you need to take a major catastrophe in order to prevent it at that point. And of course, major catastrophes occur in the universe with more frequency than we care to think about. But
Yeah, indeed. And um, what are the chances of any life in the rest of the solar system having a common origin as the life on Earth? Just considering the changing of the exchange of materials through meteor impacts
Mhm.
and comet impacts and other events like that, just causing biological material to be
Sure.
exchanged throughout the solar system. Um, how difficult do you think it would be to actually determine if it developed natively versus came about through some
Right.
type of exchange like that?
I I don't know. I'm not a biologist. I would say that that question, I think, remains largely unanswerable until we get a sample. I mean, for a while, everybody was hot and heavy about the Antarctic meteorites and the possibility that there had been Martian prebiotics carried from in from those meteorites, and that wound up not being apparently not being the case. So right now we're still kind of in Rico Fermi mode. Where are they? And until we find one, but again, I say once we find the first one, it will be just utterly fascinating to look at how it developed and if it has DNA structures similar to ours, if it is left-handed DNA rather than right-handed DNA. There are just so many things that could have happened, and I hope to live to see that first sample encountered, because I think I can't give a probability to it. I can only give a wishful thinking guess to it. I would wishfully think that on one of those three moons, we're going to find some kind of prebiotic or even early microbial type organisms. But that's, again, that's wishful thinking. It's not a legitimate estimate.
Um, it also seems to me that looking for life in these places also provides kind of like uh, another obstacle to developing and branching out into the rest of the solar system. Like, when do we feel comfortable actually building a city on Mars and not losing any knowledge that we could have had if we just left it alone?
Mhm.
Um, do you see that same kind of tension between those two goals? And if so, what do you think is the right way to navigate it?
Well, obviously, slowly and carefully, but I think as far as humanity is concerned, I think what we've seen humanity do to its various archaeological sites and things like that tells me that there will be a significant faction who will just not care about that stuff and will just say, let's go ahead and develop and exploit it as quickly as we can. So it's tough to say, right? Because now, as we're seeing more commercial ventures into space, while there are international laws governing space, I have some very interesting books about space law that I've picked up over the years. But whether those laws are enforceable or are de facto enforced, I don't know. Well, human history tends to tell me probably not. So um, I guess we're going to have to do the best we can, but I don't think there's any way that we can guarantee that we're not going to wipe out some pre-existing form of life, which would be horrible, right? It would be a horrible loss.
Yeah. Do you think there's any possibility that there's life in some form on the moon?
Again, not being a biologist, I would be skeptical, but I've been told, I think I read somewhere that there have been like tardigrades that have been on various spacecraft that land. And as we know, tardigrades seem to be resistant and able to flourish in pretty much any environment at all. So if there is life on the moon, that may be an excellent place for it to have been Earth brought contamination. Um, as far as indigenous life on the moon, I haven't seen or read anything to indicate that that would be a possibility, but you know, being surprised is half the fun, right? Maybe most of the fun is the unexpected. So,
Yeah, I think you're onto something there for sure. And just thinking about how we kind of manage astronauts' time. Um, I've talked to some flight controllers who are responsible for like actually managing the time of astronauts while they're in orbit.
mhm,
And literally like every minute of every day is like planned out.
sure,
And on one hand, it kind of makes sense because it took so much cost to get them there, and you want to make the most of it. But on the other hand, what are we missing because they're so focused on the next agenda item that they don't actually look around?
right. Yeah, this is why I think we continue to send unmanned probes as well that have a little bit more, especially the stuff that's been done with Mars, um, more open, run by scientists rather than regulated in the kind of test pilot military method of having that kind of a checklist like you're talking about. Um, but we got to do both, right? Because if nothing else, I do believe that we are inherently explorers, and that is part of what we do as human beings. So we'll go. I mean, I have no doubt that we will go to all of these places. I expect the moon and possibly Mars within my lifetime. You may get I don't know that you'll get much beyond that probably in either of our lifetimes as far as manned exploration is concerned, but I know the probes that are being set up now to go to Jupiter and Saturn again for follow-ups there. I may live long enough to see results from those. I hope so. It was great to see the pictures of the surface of Titan from Huygens when it went down landed, and now the stuff with Venus is so interesting. Although I think the rumors of potential prebiotic life in the atmosphere of Venus, I think, have largely been found to not be so. Still, Venus is another place that could be of interest, at least in terms of geology and climate science, for things that we need to be aware of, for Earth.
Yeah, I think some people think that maybe Venus had been as hospitable at one point as Earth, and that
Mm-hmm.
something happened to change its atmosphere. I wonder if it could ever be kind of changed back.
Well, never say never. The whole terraforming projects are both interesting and terrifying at the same time, and terrifying in some extent to an unethical sense. Have we the right to do that? And again, given human history, I don't think that's something that necessarily has been an overriding factor in what does and does not get done. So I expect someone will try it. I expect there will be a terraforming attempt on Mars, attempted probably before a terraforming attempt on Venus. And then, of course, we have some fairly significantly sized asteroids, like Ceres and the like, to consider as well, because I'm sure that the once the possibility of successful mining operations opens up in the asteroids, there will be the successor of Elon Musk or whomever that decides that we're going to build spacecraft to go do that, and whether they can, how long it'll take for them to make it profitable, I don't know, but it'll happen.
You mentioned that you were interested in the philosophy of technology and science. That was something that you studied. Um, can you can you talk about some of your observations that most fascinate you?
Um, well, looking at the philosophy of science in particular, the way science is treated like it is some kind of an abstract thing out there. And of course, if you actually engage and watch working scientists, you begin to understand how much of it's another human activity. It's another human activity like building buildings or painting paintings or recording music or things like that. And so it has all of the genius moments and all of the foibles that go along with being human. Right now, right, the hot topic in the philosophy of science is what's called the replication problem, which is when you perform experiments, you don't actually get the same results. And what do you do with that in terms of your conclusions, right? You typically, what you see is a lot of data perhaps being ignored, and publications come out anyway, and things like that. In technology right now, a hot topic is on the ethics of artificially intelligent systems. I'm actually a member of an IEEE working group that's working on a document for governance of, I think we call them autonomous intelligence systems, AIS is how they refer to it. That will be published probably in 2022, 2023-ish. And it will go both to governmental agencies and to corporations. And it's an international working group. And we want to put out, governance, some basic governance rules for things to consider when developing these autonomous systems that are present now and will be by 2023 extremely commonplace. And by the end of the decade, they will be everywhere. You won't be able to sneeze probably without hitting an autonomous intelligent system somewhere. I have a few in my house. So
Uh, you know, we have kind of like this whole group of people around zombies and kind of like uh, people who are. Anyway, I was just thinking it was a great metaphor for autonomous systems that are just going about their job, not realizing the implications of what they're doing. The door that continuously opens and closes, and
mm-hmm.
the autonomous car that keeps trying to make that delivery
Oh,
around the
right.
block and keeps.
Yeah.
It's really going to be a challenging world to live in. But um, how? I mean, it seems like with these autonomous systems, and they're so easy to build, and like you said, they're going to be everywhere. How is it possible to have effective guidance and governance of them?
How is it possible? Well, it certainly won't be possible if nobody tries. And so I think at very least, making the good faith effort. And there are a lot of, it's interesting, the working group that I belong to is, I would guess, probably close to 50% attorneys
Hmm.
of all things, because they want it to be able to get to the point where they can, there can be laws and legislation and things like that involved here. I come at it from a technical background where I see how the things get built and have tried to build a few of my own. And, um, bridging the gaps between the various disciplines that are involved here is, again, much like spaceflight being a unifying thing for the human race. I think bridging these gaps is a unifying thing for a lot of different disciplines, whether they be purely academic or practical engineering or legal and social, or there are so many different, it's a complex problem, and there are so many different ranges of thought that need to be brought to bear on it. Which I think is the only way that it's going to be possible. It isn't going to be possible through a purely technological solution or through a purely legal solution or anything like that. It's going to take cooperation between a lot of different sources. And whether we can achieve that cooperation, I mean, we did achieve cooperation with Apollo of a sort. So one likes to hope that we can do it again.
Yeah, exactly. I just thinking autonomous agents might be the way to enforce the rules around autonomous agents somehow. Kind of.
Maybe.
Um, are there some guidelines that you have already kind of stumbled on and said, you know, these are sort of like the three laws of robotics, if you will?
Um, I'll tell you what I find when I'm with this group is there have been points in my life where I was kind of used to being the smartest kid in the room. When I'm around these folks, I am not even in the same league with some of them. There are some staggering intellects that I have met here, which is one of the great joys of participating in this group. We're still in the early stages, and given the IEEE's pretty strong copyright restrictions, what I can say or show about that is actually pretty limited. Um, the things that do stick out, though, just from observations in the news and whatnot, are things like algorithmic bias and things like that, where there are clear instances of systems being trained very poorly with respect to entire populations and focusing very heavily on a single, dare I say, white male population in too many cases, and that has started to become recognized, and people are starting to take steps to do it, to do something about it. Transparency in machine learning systems is another thing, right? We have things like Watson doing medical diagnoses and things like that to assist physicians, but the thing with machine learning systems is it's very difficult to find out how they arrive at the conclusions that they arrive at, and there is no practical way of asking them how they arrive at the conclusions that they arrive at. Transparency is another fundamental principle that we're trying to push for, to be able to do that, to say, okay, yeah, that's a good recommendation. How'd you get there? And be able to get an intelligible answer as a response rather than having to stare at a black box and try to figure out what it did. So those are two areas I know that are real hot topics right now.
And that's a very good one. Yeah, I just see you have to make your training set publicly available or at least auditable or something like that. So you can see what trained the machine learning algorithm and how people can maybe
In a
something like
sense,
that.
yeah, and since of course so much of that stuff again is being done by private corporations, that's not going to happen. And so what we almost need is there used to be black box games that we had. I remember when we were kids where the thing was doing inside and you would do various tests on it and you would have to try to figure out how it was doing what it did. We're probably going to need that kind of software where you can look at the black box of the machine learning, figure out how to send inputs into it, and by looking at the outputs that you get, try to figure out what it's actually doing in there, because even the people who write them now, they can't understand it because they're so complicated, and the algorithms modify themselves. That's what machine learning is all about, is learning from your data sets. And so it's complicated. It's extraordinarily complicated.
Um, so uh, I get a lot of questions about why are we going back to the moon? And I was wondering
Mhm.
if you had a favorite answer of why we should be doing this.
Why are we going back to the moon? The best answer I have is simply that it is practice as a stepping stone for going to Mars and the other planets. The moon has a lot of interesting stuff yet to be found out about it. I'm not sure that we need to have people there in order to find that stuff out. But in order to be able to do more advanced manned space exploration, it's a good practice run, right? It's a walk before you run kind of thing, and we kind of crawled before, and now we'd like to walk, and then after that we can worry about running. I think of things like the what is it the Breakthrough Starshot program that thinks they can put together small laser powered probes to send to Proxima Centauri at achieving like 60-70% the speed of light, so they can get them there within a single person's lifetime. And maybe, I don't know if they think they can get data back or not, then I kind of doubt it. But I mean, that's, again, you want to walk, that's walking to the stars, and you need to do that before you can learn to run to the stars, which I also believe, if, the human race, again, does not obliterate itself, which is that interesting T at the end of the Drake equation, how long does the advanced civilization actually exist, that we have no idea about. But I think it will happen if we're around to do it.
So as far as I can tell, humans are pretty much the only civilized species. I don't know if civilized is the right word, but technological species on Earth. Um, how come we don't see other like uh, why have humans developed and other things haven't? I mean, what are your
Well, I think we do see some use of technology in other species, clearly not to the same degree that we have. Um, Damn good question. I don't know that I have an answer to it. I know I do a lot of reading on people who do research both with primates and with, what is it, cephalids, whales, and dolphins, and like that. The octopus is an area of great interest to people looking at developing intelligence, and an intelligence that is in many ways extremely alien to our own. Um, their survival doesn't depend on having advanced technology, but they do have technologies after a fashion. Um, I think maybe that was just the kicker, is that for some reason our ancestors, in order to survive, had to develop some kind of a way to gain an advantage over the other competing animals and things in the ecosystem. And once we started making, flint knives and spears and bows and arrows in particular, I suspect was a huge advance. And then, of course, we had that wonderful, the greatest technology ever put into the hands of humanity, which is language and reading and writing. And that one, I think, has probably been the bootstrap for most all of the others.
It's funny you mentioned the octopus. I saw a little bitty not animation, but video the other day of an octopus running on the sea floor, and it
Mm-hmm.
was saying that, really you shouldn't think of it as having 8 legs, but rather 6 arms and 2 legs, because it was actually
Uh,
using two of the legs to walk, and I'd never seen that before. It's kind of eye-opening.
So my understanding from the biology of the octopus is, besides having a largish central brain in their head, they actually have 8 independent brains in each tentacle,
Hmm.
that govern each tentacle as well, which are smaller. And as a distributed computing fan, I thought that was a pretty interesting development there. So the thing with other animals is, A, they need enough time. They need enough time to develop, and B, they need to get rid of the 800-pound gorilla on the block that's their competitor for everything, which is of course us. And You know, if that happens, I suspect some other animal will evolve to fill the niche, because that seems to be how evolution goes.
It's really fascinating. If it was safe and affordable, would you have any interest in going into space?
I would have when I was younger. At this point, quite frankly, I don't know if I could deal with the G-forces of a launch. Just, you know, my body is not what it used to be. And so at this juncture, I would probably have to pass unless there was some very, very low G way of doing it, which maybe something like a space elevator or some darn thing like that might make it feasible. But no, I'm content to leave that particular thing to people more physically adept than I am.
There's a effort underway in Florida called Space Perspectives, where
Mhm.
they'll have like a capsule with like 9 people in it, 8 passengers and a pilot. Um, that's taken to the edge of the atmosphere using a hydrogen balloon,
Ah, okay.
and it takes maybe all day to go up there and
Hmm.
come down. Uh, of course, you won't be in orbit. You won't technically even be in space, but
Right.
from that altitude, you can see the curvature of the Earth and the blackness of space. Um, would something like that be of interest to you?
Hmm. Maybe. It's hard to say. Um, I would certainly not want to get in the way of other people to whom it was of greater interest to. I mean, you can tell I like the curvature of space just looking at my Zoom background, right? Picture from the ISS of the Earth from orbit. Um, Again, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, yeah, I'd probably be all over that. But now I am okay with my vicarious pursuits. I mean, if someone wants to put a camera up there and take some pictures and send me their pictures, I would be delighted to view them. But
Uh, and how soon do you think it'll be before we actually have humans living their entire life off of Earth? Like, is that something that we're likely to see in a generation or two, or you think that's like really far off?
um, my answer to that question depends on, oddly enough, the technologies that are related to like CRISPR and things like that, because I can see humans going to Mars. I don't know that I see humans adapting to Mars rather than engineered starting from humans and making Martians instead out of them. That is, that, you know, bodies that would be comfortable with the lower gravity, the thinner atmosphere, the like there. As far as like living in pressure domes, yeah, I mean, that will be a starting place, but I don't really see that as the long-term sustainable method of doing that. So the question is an interesting one in, will those people ultimately be humans
Hmm.
or not, or will they be Martians, or will they be whatevers? And I tend to think that we will genetically assist um, those descendants into more quickly adapting to their environment than they could evolutionarily. Obviously, that'd take too long. So.
Yeah, talking about adapting humans to live on Mars reminded me of a Frederick Pohl novel where they actually, I kind of did that exact exact thing. But that's an interesting point. If we start changing ourselves, what does it mean to be ourselves? I mean, like, what makes you Craig and what makes me Nathan? And at what point do we stop being whoever it is we are?
Exactly. And that goes back philosophically to something which was called the ship of Theseus. And that was the old thing where, hey, Theseus is on his boat, but he needs to replace a plank, and then he needs to replace another plank, and eventually he replaces all the planks. Is it still the ship of Theseus or not? And that puzzle has been around forever. And I have my answers to it, but the whole question of what makes us uniquely us is a very fascinating one, and one that is another hot topic in both biological science and psychology and in philosophy. Right, that the whole identity problem. I have some ideas there which are actually a bit mathematical in nature, but it's just my version of a wild guess that I don't think we have a handle on that at all. I think all believe that it is true, but I don't think we have a handle on why it would be true or why it should be true.
I just wondering, using that boat example and the plank, maybe it's about how much we change and how quickly we change and how soon we own the change. Maybe it's less about, the final outcome versus the process.
Sure. Yep. Life is a process and not a thing. Yes, I absolutely believe that's true. I mean, I'm not right. Pretty much every cell in my body is been replaced from what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or whatever. But I'm still me, and I still and have no doubt that I am me, and people still recognize me and say, "Hi, Craig," and like that. So, um, what what makes an individual a unique individual? And it's a good question. Is it a DNA sequence to some extent, maybe, but is it the process of how information interacts with that DNA sequence? I think maybe that's the secret sauce that that's involved.
And and is that really important? And why is it important to us? That type of thing. Or why do we need to still be us? I guess it almost seems like something so fundamental. It's difficult to even investigate.
Um, Another really good question. It is I guess you can say it's part of our nature, right? It's part of our nature to question about everything, but particularly to question about ourselves. And if we don't have a satisfactory answer, we have to keep digging at the puzzle, because in some respects that's what it is. It's a puzzle we think we can solve, and maybe we can and maybe we can't. Um, but it's not going to stop us from keeping digging at it. Much like going back to the moon, right? It's in some respects it's a puzzle to be solved, and so we're going to do it. Um, Whether we're going to do it sooner or whether we're going to do it later is largely immaterial. It will get done by somebody. Again, those somebodies may well not be launching from U.S. soil, and then that's cool. So we'll see.
Area of fascination for me recently is looking at sci-fi films, books, and movies from other languages and cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I see it as an expression of at least some segment of those groups of people actually dreaming of themselves being in space. And
Sure.
I was wondering if you had come across any type of um, sci-fi and other cultures that kind of surprised you.
Um, Surprised. Um, yeah, I mean, occasionally I see things that I hadn't considered before presented to me, and that's always kind of cool. Actually, for a non-sci-fi thing that I've just been rewatching lately is the Tyson Cosmos remake series, particularly the second season of it, where he does all these little interesting historical vignettes about it. And there was one about the Russian scientist who basically came up with what we now call lunar orbit rendezvous, which was the system of how the Apollo command module and LEM separated to go to the moon and back up, and that actually I mean, the guy had been thinking about that. I think it was like at the end of the 19th century. So finding out things like that surprise me about ideas that are much older than I think any of us thinks they are, until we actually look at them. And that kind of thing is good.
And maybe we need to spend more time studying older thinkers. The people. I'm really amazed about the 1800s and 1700s and kind of what
Hmm.
was developed then in terms of mechanical. I mean, just reading was it War Between the Worlds, War of the
Hmm.
Worlds. I mean, that was written in like the 1900 or so,
Yep.
and it's just amazing how accurate some of its descriptions turned out to be.
Well, Wells was an incredible prophet, I think, in many ways that we can still mine some of the ideas that he came up with. I don't, Mel and Verne, and yeah, no, that late 19th century is a very interesting time period.
I feel like the writing back then seems so much more deep than a lot of the stuff that I read today. Maybe it's just we have way more writers, and back the writers that survived from 100 years ago were only the ones that were worth surviving. Maybe it's sampling bias, and if we lived during that time, we'd be reading a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't really worth
Yeah,
reading.
that, and I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow, but if you're not, that'd be worth picking up to read, and to your viewers as well. But Kahneman's thesis is that we usually make decisions quickly because we need to, and they tend to be emotionally driven and things like that, and that's thinking fast. And then there's more what we would call rational long-term planning kinds of thinking, and that would be thinking slow. I think how that plays to your question is, I think in the 19th century, I don't think the need to do that fast thinking on so many subjects is the way it is now, where we're so heavily bombarded by so many information sources that we need to rapidly process our way through. We have to do a lot of fast thinking today, and it's more difficult, I think, to do the slow thinking now than it was then, when things were generally slower, for people.
You think that's impeding our progress?
It's hard to say, because I don't know that I have seen a worthwhile metric of progress that impresses me enough to be able to say, to give an answer to that. I think it may impede a lot of people's enjoyment of their lives. And in that sense, personal progress, if one wants to look at it that way, I think that can be a big deal. As far as civilization progress, um, thinking fast rather than thinking slowly. And when I say in terms of a society, thinking fast, having, things based on quarterly reports driving your planning system versus having concerted long range planning. Had NASA, for example, had concerted long range planning, we wouldn't need to be talking about, are we going to be landing on the moon in 2024, because we would have done it in 1990 or something like that instead. But because everything is being driven by corporate quarterly reports and governmental election cycles, that's as far as the people look ahead, is to the next cycle. And if we have that kind of fast thinking, yeah, okay, progress, that may even be hindering our survival chances. So I guess
Yeah.
in that sense.
Oh, exactly. I mean, it seems like we have a longer term outlook for monetary policy than science and exploration and development, at least.
Yeah, things like the NSF, they've done, I think, the best that they could in trying to get, long-term research programs. And the universities, to the extent that the universities are still, higher research institutions, they, but even they live, from grant to grant. And so it's, kind of limiting in that sense. I don't know. I could probably go on for hours about educational reform, but I won't even get started on that. Other than to mention, of course, Apollo, and again, what it did for the education system is it created a generation of or two of engineers that were responsible for, amongst other things, Silicon Valley and all that you wouldn't have had without probably the need to, for example, build better computers, right? Right, my phone has more computing power than all of NASA had in 1969. So so in that sense, that emphasis into education and the spin-offs that resulted therefrom is probably the single greatest benefit that the space program actually brought to humanity, I think, was that explosion of people wanting to do that stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of funny if the Apollo program kept going and all those engineers and other technical people stayed employed in the Apollo program, maybe we would not have had all these spin-offs that we did. Maybe the personal computer would still
Yeah.
be a thing of the future, and the internet would be still something that we're kind of, um, is something that wasn't developed.
Yeah, I mean, my gut hunch is that had things gone more in that direction, what you probably see more is wearable devices, because there would be wearable devices made to assist the astronauts and the people on the, and so you probably see that more widely deployed than it is now. Although that's another new hot topic, right? Everybody and his brother has an Apple Watch, and I'm looking forward to getting my set of AR glasses at some point that I can use to, again, that'd be a way I'd vicariously participate in that stratospheric balloon mission, is if someone puts something up there where I can put on my AR glasses and see as if I were there, then I'd do that in a heartbeat. And I suspect that will happen within this decade. I think would be my best guess.
Yeah. I mean, also the thinking, whenever we go to the moon, the technology allow for people to experience it in a much more
Mhm.
high fidelity way.
Right, you
So,
are there. Yep, it's
well, Craig, I really appreciate your time.
yeah.
Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
No, I think you let me ramble on considerably here for this, and I appreciate the rambling, and I think what you're doing is just spectacular, and I hope that everything that these interviews are all being archived, because someday some historian of technology is going to want to look at these archives to say, what were people thinking about this stuff in 2021? And here we go.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think of too. I mean, they're on YouTube. I have copies of them, of course, and I'm putting all the ones that I do up until probably a week or two from now on this little micro SD card. It's a
Oh, sure.
1 TB micro SD card that's
Mhm.
actually going to the moon on
Oh, pretty good.
Astrobotics moon landing. I,
Outstanding.
I'm not sure how it's going to fare with the radiation and the heat and the cold, but
Right.
maybe the people of the future have this amazing reconstructive technology that's able to.
Yeah, it'll be kind of like the Voyager Golden Record, so that will be good.
Well, good deal. Thank you so much, and
You're
hopefully
very welcome.
someday we get to meet up in person.
I would love that.
Okay. Well, you have a good rest of your day.
All right, take care.
Bye bye.